I've said it before, I am not an audiophile, but I do like good sound and good equipment, and I know what each of those things means to me. After all, they are pretty subjective. But what I don't like is spending a ton of money. So I had a simple question. Is it possible to get high-fidelity playback of high-quality and high-resolution music sources on the cheap? And how about adding in a few modern conveniences just to sweeten the deal? Well, let's find out. First, I'll warn you that this video is pretty quickly going to go off on a long tangent about high-res music in general and why you definitely want it, along with some of its potential pitfalls, before circling back around to talking about the cheap hardware I'm now using to play it. I'll add chapter breaks down below. Feel free to use them. Also, just a quick disclaimer that as usual, I'm not going to be able to play much, if any, music that might run afoul of YouTube's copyright algorithms in this video. And I'm not going to be able to get you to hear high-res music quality through YouTube anyway. You'll just have to make do with my confused old man ramblings.
Get off my lawn.
But let's talk about the goal here. As some of my long-term subscribers may know, I have a 2-channel, stereo, audio rack in a spare room. This one. It was originally made up of hand-me-downs and thrift store finds and is supposed to be kind of a cheap hobby. But it's actually turned into my main way to listen to music at home, because for the most part, it actually sounds pretty great. But being such a hodgepodge, it's always had 2 big problems. The first is that I didn't really have any way at all of playing my high-resolution music files and hearing them as intended. These are mostly 96 kHz 24-bit FLAC files that I either bought online or in some cases got as free downloads with vinyl purchases. Most people seem to stream even high-res music these days, though more on that a little later. But the fact that so much vinyl now seems to just come with high-res downloadable files suggests that I can't be the only one without a good way to play them. Even if you're not actively seeking out high-res, you're probably finding it if you're a certain kind of music fan. Incidentally, I think this is a great argument for buying vinyl. You'll usually get high-quality digital files along with an analog physical format to play and collect for only a few dollars more than the digital files themselves. So the main goal is just a way to play these files properly on my home stereo without breaking the bank. Decent high-res playback is usually thought of as kind of an esoteric audiophile-ish feature, so I wasn't sure how easy this would be. My relatively inexpensive Denon AV receiver does theoretically play high-res files through a USB stick, but it always seems to skip tracks or get stuck or have other issues, and it doesn't sound very good doing it anyway. This is an AV system that's just not tuned very well for stereo music. But hey, it sounds great doing this. I also just wanted to try to get better Bluetooth. My Monoprice amp came from the early days of Bluetooth in home systems, and honestly, it sounds like absolute butt. In fact, I've never had good Bluetooth sound in a home audio component. I didn't even know if it was possible. I always just assumed that, like pre-recorded cassettes back in the day or early low bitrate MP3s, crappy Bluetooth is just something people put up with for convenience sake. Again, my Denon receiver will do it too, but it might actually sound worse at Bluetooth than the Monoprice amp. I've tried everything to improve Bluetooth sound quality with these components, but I've given up at this point. Down in the comments right now, somebody's writing, Sonos, done. This video isn't really for you for reasons that should already be obvious, so feel free to click off if that somebody is you. Now, here's the long tangent I mentioned before, because somebody else who hasn't even watched this far is currently typing a rant about how you can't tell the difference between high-res and normal music anyway. And I'm not going to sit here and claim I can reliably, but here's the deal. High-res lossless formats are theoretically reference quality, usually as good as the original recording, in any case the best you can get. If you want to make a 320K 16-bit MP3 from that to listen to in your car, you can. I do it too. But you can do it with your own software and settings for the least quality loss. It's the modern equivalent of buying a pre-recorded, usually low-quality cassette versus buying a CD and recording it yourself on a chrome or metal tape. Or just listening to the CD. Here's a little relevant life tip from an old geezer. Make perfection your goal in anything. If you then need to compromise, that's okay. You're compromising from perfection. The result is still going to be really good. You'll have a much better result than if you start out expecting garbage and then allow compromises from there. And yes, that applies to music. With high resolution also comes greater dynamic range. This doesn't always really matter, depending on how a recording is mixed and mastered, but it can. Here's a great example. This is the Japanese band Scandal's song Runner's High. At the top is a 9624 FLAC file downloaded from mora.jp, a site owned by a bunch of Japanese record labels, and on the bottom the same track in uncompressed WAV format ripped from the CD. I haven't done anything to either of these files, nor is the view zoomed in. If you don't see what I'm talking about, just look at how the bottom two waveforms, the dark blue part, is pressed right up against the edge of the track window. This is what we call brick walling. It means there's no real difference between the loudest parts of the track and no dynamics from one moment to the next. If you didn't know better, you could look at this and say, but it just looks like there's more music on the bottom track. But that's not how waveforms work. It's just louder. You see that lighter blue shade in the middle? That's the RMS loudness. We'll just call it the average, even though that's not quite right. If we just reduce its volume so that both tracks are a match in loudness, look at what happens. Now you can see how the CD track really just has a lot less dynamic range and appears heavily clipped. In fact, if you compare the quieter parts of each, you can see that they're basically an exact match. The CD track is the high-res track, with its peaks just sliced right off. The high-res track is the original recording, at least between these two masters, with dynamics intact. After seeing this, why would you ever listen to the normal res version over the high-res file if you had a choice? You can literally see the difference, and this isn't the spectrogram showing frequencies above where people can hear. This is the waveform. This is audible. You've probably all heard about the loudness war. Well, here's your way around it. If you do want to see the spectrogram, here it is at the same scale. Looks pretty similar, right? But while the CD track is maxed out at 22 kilohertz, look what I can do to the high-res file. There is a lot more music up there. Granted, you won't hear most or even any of that, but why wouldn't you want it if it's there? You're paying for this. I may not eat every Dorito in the bag before it goes stale, but I'm not going to just dump out half of it at the grocery store and still pay $3.29. Nor am I going to subscribe to a monthly supply of Doritos where half the chips are missing to start with. Aha! There's your streaming analogy. There is also some evidence that even if you don't consciously hear sounds above 20 kilohertz, your brain is still processing them. Sound waves still exist, whether we actually perceive them as sound or not. It seems reasonable to believe that they still might affect us on some level, and various experiments with ultrasonic sound waves show that they do. This is true of our eyesight too. We can see certain wavelengths of radiation, but others still affect us even though they're not visible. And sound waves might do similar things. Whatever the case, human perception is not an exact science and in many ways is not fully understood. What we do know is that there's a lot more to the world and indeed the universe than what we meatbags can see and hear, and some of those physical processes outside of our limited sensory perception do still affect us pretty profoundly. Just ask this guy. But just to make things confusing, not every high-res track is a perfect recording, and not every track or album listed as high-res to begin with even actually is. And I have my share of fakes. These technically have the specs of a high-res file, but they don't have any additional data over the standard resolution file. It's not always clear-cut, but one easy way to spot a fake is just by looking at the spectrogram. This is Chinese Satellite from Phoebe Bridgers' Punisher album, and it's a real high-res master, but not the best I've seen. The spectrogram shows plenty of music above the 22 kHz frequency that's the approximate limit for a standard resolution source, but there are also a couple of specific frequencies that appear to just be noise. The track I Know the End on that same album has the right channel and only the right channel brick-walled at the end, which is just weird. So this recording has some flaws, and I can hear some of those in real life, but it does look and sound like it's a real high-resolution master. I bought this album
this one time
at Bandcamp if you want to make sure you get the same high-res download options I did. This is what a high-res track should look like. This is Pink Floyd's Money from the Dark Side of the Moon Immersion box set, which I've ripped from Blu-ray to FLAC. It's not brick-walled or clipped, there's not obvious noise in the spectrogram, and it's got natural peaks all the way up to 48 kHz, which suggests a true 96 kHz master. There's a bit of a roll-off around the 20 or 25 kilohertz mark, but that's about the limit of what most people can hear, and it's probably also natural to the instruments Pink Floyd were using at the time. But it's not a straight line artificial cutoff, is my point. Here's Hayley Williams' Asystole from 2021's Flowers for Vases / Descansos album. Honestly, I'm only picking some of my favorite artists and songs here, so I'm not here to blaspheme Hayley. I love this album, and I think it's generally recorded well, and I picked this song because I was listening to it for the 100th time and thought it was special enough to look at. Seriously, she's become kind of an artistic genius, writing all her own music and playing literally all of the instruments on her latest album. Both of her solo albums are surprising and beautiful, and you should buy them. I love Hayley Williams. But look at the spectrogram. There's a clear cutoff at 22 kilohertz. The few things above that are probably just noise, so it's a 44.1 kilohertz master even though it's a 96 kilohertz file. The waveform also shows what looks like some light clipping, so you may not be seeing much benefit from the increased dynamic range either. And unless you happen to find people like me talking about this in reviews, there's probably no way for you to know that in advance of buying it. I just went back to Pro Studio Masters, where I bought this, and checked the technical notes, and lo and behold, look at this confusing bit of nonsense. It seems to imply that it was recorded at 44.1 kilohertz, then mastered at 96 kilohertz for some reason. At least it's apparently really 24-bit, but that doesn't matter that much if it's clipped anyway, though you are getting a lower noise floor in the quiet bits. But I guess the lesson is buyer beware. It's just unfortunate, and honestly, it could be one reason why some people think high-res music sounds the same as standard res. This is still the best quality you can buy this album in, as far as I know. So, what does this have to do with anything? I guess the point I'm making is that not every high-res file is created equal, and a good system is going to reveal any flaws in the recording. So if you buy a high-res player or system and find it doesn't sound very good, it might just be the recordings you're listening to. Demand better as a music consumer. We are the ones that allowed recorded music to go to shit in the first place. High-res music should never be brick-walled like this, nor cut off at 22 kilohertz, nor should it have these noise bands even if they're not technically audible. In fact, as I was editing this video, I had a guy in my comments on another video who claimed to be a quote, Billboard Top 100 sound engineer, and who didn't understand the difference between lossless and lossy compression. This is what we're up against as music consumers. It's not always malice. Some people in any industry just aren't very good at their jobs. But when we're the ones paying the money, we have the right to demand they improve. But now back to the task at hand. There are home audio components made specifically for playing high-res files. These have high-quality digital-to-analog converters and other internal parts specifically made to match these formats, but they don't come cheap. And by cheap, I mean like under $200. They're components for audiophiles with money to burn. There has to be a better way.
As I rained blows upon him, I realized there had to be another way.
If I learned one thing in my time selling home electronics, it's that there is always a cheaper solution to good sound, without major sacrifices, and sometimes even with unexpected benefits. Credit to Techmoan for the first half of the solution. I'll link to his video in the description below. He's tested a couple of Sony Walkman models, and these aren't exactly new, but it was his video on updating the firmware of the NWA-55 that finally convinced me to buy one. I don't think that most people realize that Sony's portable digital players are high-res players, even at the low end. I admit that I didn't. This one normally costs $218, although it pretty regularly goes on sale for $168, and that's the price I paid for it. And it will play pretty much any high-resolution format you throw at it. That includes FLAC up to 24-bit 384 kHz, Apple lossless to the same specs, WAVE up to 32-bit 384 kHz, AIF to the same, DSD to 11.3 MHz, MQA, and others that are a bit less common. Importantly, it also outputs up to 40 kHz sound through its headphone jack. It'd be kind of worthless as a high-res portable player if it didn't, but you know, I'll bet such players exist, and people probably buy them. It's just the way this industry is. Since I'm talking about a portable player first, let's just deal with the phone question, since that's what most people use for music these days. I did too for a long time. As I was filming this, Apple even announced Apple lossless and supposedly high-res playback for Apple Music, which many people think is a big deal. But guess what? If you're playing music on an iPhone, and this is true for both streaming and locally stored files, you can only even get lossless audio with Apple's Lightning to 3.5mm adapter. And lossless is not the same as high-res. To get 96 kHz 24-bit audio, which is kind of the unofficial threshold for true high resolution and the most common format of the albums I already have, you need to use an external DAC. The iPhone isn't alone in being limited like this. Only a few phones really have half-decent DACs and an analog output anymore. I have an older one, but it's just kind of painful to use today. I really didn't want to be buying a high-end external DAC and an amp to go with it, so no. A phone was not an option for me. The point of this exercise is to really get proper high-res playback just as cheaply and conveniently as possible. Think of it like trying to find the best cheap full-frame camera for those times when a phone camera just isn't good enough. Techmoan's problem was that he found the sound of the NWA55 a little tiring compared to the more expensive NWA100. A custom firmware by Mr. Walkman aimed to bring the sound signature of the A55 closer to Sony's high-end WM1Z player. Techmoan installed it, had no problems, thought it sounded a bit better, and that was enough for me. I bought one and did the same. It is a fully reversible process, so nothing to lose. And while it doesn't sound hugely different to me, it sure sounds pretty damn good through my Audio-Technica ATH M50X BTs. I have absolutely no complaints, and I've enjoyed sitting down and listening to a bunch of my music through this player over the past few months. It is the kind of player, and so are these relatively inexpensive headphones, by the way, that makes you want to sit and really pay attention to the music, because you can hear all sorts of details that you might have otherwise missed. So, thanks, Techmoan. By the way, always buy FLAC files over MQA, and don't pay extra to stream MQA either. The A55 is not a streaming player, but the A100 is if you want that capability. The downsides are that it costs more, it runs full Android with all that entails, and it has worse battery life. It's basically a phone with a headphone jack, a DAC, and high-res audio support, but no actual phone. Not really my thing in a dedicated music player, but some people might think streaming ability outweighs those issues. But my point right now is don't stream or buy MQA. Check the description for another link to a video explaining and showing why. It's well beyond my scope here, but it's definitely worth watching the linked video. For some reason, the audio industry is just drowned in snake oil and always has been. Just buy FLACs, or if you want to stream from somewhere like Amazon HD that doesn't use MQA. Now, all this was well and good, and it was clear that I was getting a real high-res experience from my Walkman, but I still wanted to get this music playing through my home speakers. Since I had two amps doing different things, I went back and forth on getting a really good vintage stereo receiver to replace my 1970s era Sony, or something more modern with better Bluetooth, but potentially without a decent phono preamp to replace my Monoprice. I quickly ruled out a new integrated amp due to cost. Manufacturers see stereo amplifiers as an audiophile market and price them accordingly, because audiophiles will pay those prices. I wanted something decent, but again, cheap, and I mean cheap. Could you believe there's a decent new stereo receiver for about $150? I didn't really believe it myself. I'd seen it when browsing and sorting by price, but hadn't really considered it seriously until watching a couple of YouTube videos from self-described audiophiles. And it's saying something when an audiophile doesn't completely trash a $150 component. The receiver in question is the Sony STR DH190. Apparently this can sometimes be found for just $99, which would make it almost an impulse buy, something you pick up on the way out of Walmart with your pickle-flavored ice pops and your powdered horse milk. Actual Walmart products, by the way. But normally it's $149, and I think it's a deal even at that price. Just a quick update. As often seems to happen, Sony has raised the MSRP of this model to $169 as I've been filming this video. I still think it's a pretty good deal even at $169, although obviously not as good of a deal as the $149 I paid for it or the $99 other people have gotten it for. But look for it on sale. I'm sure Sony has built in the possibility of sales into that $169 MSRP, so you'll probably find it on sale fairly often. This is a 100 watt per channel stereo receiver with 3 standard line level RCA inputs, a tape input and output, a phono input, and a front portable input specifically for devices like the NWA55 Walkman and their headphone outputs. That's basically exactly what I need. It's almost retro in its featured inputs, though with a couple extra over what most vintage or modern stereo receivers include. It also has Bluetooth, of course, and a remote, something I'd never had in this system before, and it is a welcome addition. And it's got a high-res audio badge, though we'll get to what that means in a minute. Everything on the front face of this receiver is plastic. What do you expect for $150? I normally don't buy such plasticky components, but the features and reviews just won me over. The rest of the case is metal. The faux brushed aluminum appearance on the front is pretty convincing in the right light, but with reflections at a certain angle, you can see the waviness and imperfections that scream fast-drying injection mold. Hey, if it sounds good, I can overlook it. Sony seems to have put all of their budget into the amp itself. The whole thing is actually quite heavy. The internal components look fairly heavy-duty through the top vents, and the website itself describes the care that went into both using these heavy-duty components and isolating them for the best sound quality. Sometimes I really think manufacturers do this kind of thing on purpose. Many manufacturers have sleeper components at low price points that punch above their weight in terms of performance. They're just not flashy. I searched for what the high-res audio badge is supposed to mean on this receiver, since as far as I can tell, the only digital processing it's doing anywhere is in its Bluetooth input, and none of that's high resolution at all. But it turns out that this logo does actually mean something even for an analog amp. The Japan Audio Society regulates this and certifies each component only after it meets the required specs and passes a listening test. In the case of an analog amp like this one, the only spec that needs to be met is reproduction of 40 kHz signals or above. That's something, at least. The STR-DH190's frequency response is 10 Hz to 100 kHz, though so is my Denon's, which is also high-res certified, and as I mentioned, it doesn't sound great. But at least it's not just a badge that anyone can just stick on. My Monoprice amp is only rated to 20 kHz, and consequently can't carry that badge. It may just be a Japanese thing anyway, but still. However it actually sounds, the Monoprice is just not capable of reproducing the full range of a high-res audio file. This Sony is. I hooked the receiver up and connected my A55 with a wire, listening to a bunch of my favorite high-res tracks. The volume was a little low, but it sounded great, as good as I know my speakers are capable of, and far better than I've been able to get with any portable device on any amplifier I'd been using previously. Using a wire means I'm using the DAC in the Walkman, and only using the receiver to amplify the analog signal. I tried switching on the pure direct mode and heard basically no difference, and this is a good thing. Pure Direct is something that a lot of receivers support, and it's supposed to cut all the sound processing and enhancements that the amp is doing, while also removing any sources of interference and providing as straight a signal path as possible. For example, the STR-DH190 even switches off the display to reduce noise. When I've switched to this mode on other amps, including my Denon AVR, the result is thin and shrill and not anything I'd really want to listen to. That suggests that these components have to do a lot of internal processing to sound good. But on the STR-DH190, there was almost no difference. Both the regular and pure direct modes sounded full but balanced and neutral, and I would happily listen in pure direct all the time. That's a sign of a good amp. Oh, did I mention that this thing costs $150? Next, I switched over to Bluetooth, also on the A55. I've never heard good Bluetooth audio anywhere. The volume difference actually freaked out my dog. Guess I should have RTFM. After turning it down, I listened for a while, and while I do think I could hear the difference between Bluetooth and the wired connection, it really wasn't very pronounced at all. If anything, Bluetooth seems a little brighter and a tad metallic compared to the analog connection, but I didn't hear any sibilance or anything. But yeah, I could actually listen to this Bluetooth if I was playing background music in the kitchen or something and didn't want to mess with a wire. It sounds pretty good. Let's just talk for a second about how Bluetooth audio works. Each device is going to be connected to another through a particular codec, and it'll generally be whichever codec is the best they both share. A codec is just an encoder and decoder. It's a piece of software sitting on a chip. When you transmit your music via Bluetooth, it's first decoded by the codec, then re-encoded for transmission using the codec's own lossy compression algorithm. And yes, this is true even if you're playing an AAC file using the AAC codec. A lot of tests have been done that show this. The codec on the receiving end decodes it again, and from that point it typically takes the same path to your ears as any other digital audio. There are a few common Bluetooth codecs. SBC is the lowest common denominator that all Bluetooth devices support, and it'll typically max out at 345 kilobits per second, though it can be much lower depending on the implementation, and this is the reason for its poor reputation. AAC is the same thing Apple uses for the files sold on Apple Music, and it maxes out at 250 kilobits per second. But it's a more advanced codec, so some people think it sounds better anyway. Then there's aptX and aptX HD, the latter of which gets up to 576 kilobits per second, and Sony's own LDAC, which maxes out at 990 kilobits per second. Sony advertises this as being high-res quality, but that depends on what you consider to be high-res in this case. It can do 96 kilohertz at 24 bits, but it's using lossy compression, which negates a lot of the benefits of that. And LDAC often actually connects at either 330 or 660 kilobits per second, depending on your device. So it's typically not really any better than other codecs. But it can be, and it's owned by Sony, so I should be good to go, right? The NWA55 supports all of those except AAC. It does support Sony's own LDAC, as you'd expect. The STR-DH190, though, only supports SBC and, oddly, AAC, which the A55 doesn't. So the best shared codec between the two is SBC, the lowest common denominator. I find this the one real frustrating oddity of this receiver. It's not like Sony has a higher-end stereo receiver that they're trying to differentiate from. This is it. So you'd think they'd just go ahead and support their own codec. But nope. It's SBC or nothing when using their own receiver with their own portable player, despite owning a superior codec themselves. That said, there's more to SBC than what you've probably heard. It is a pretty flexible codec, and there's more that goes into Bluetooth than just the codec. Once the data is received by the amp, it goes through a digital to analog conversion, then gets amplified and sent to your speakers. You can have a lossy MP3 at SBC-like bit rates that sounds great with the right DAC and amp, and the same is true of Bluetooth. Or so I know now, because this receiver does sound pretty great even just using SBC. My previous experiences with Bluetooth audio were probably just the results of bad DACs, bad SBC settings, bad amps, or some combination of all three. Bluetooth just seems really sensitive to weak links anywhere in its complicated chain. Luckily, the implementation here seems good at every given point, so it sounds good even with SBC. While this isn't meant to be a full review of this receiver, in case you're wondering about its other functions and inputs, I have tested playing vinyl, CDs and SACDs, cassettes, and FM radio with it as well. They all sound as you'd expect, which is to say as good as I've heard these formats in a while, probably since the last time I owned a stereo receiver, which was a monster SAE2R9 that I wish I hadn't sold off. SACD is, of course, a high-resolution format itself, and with the DAC and line-level outputs in my Pioneer Elite BDP52FD, I do think it sounds a bit better than the Walkman. The BDP52 is a Blu-ray player that also plays a bunch of other formats, including high-res music, but it only does so via pre-recorded disc formats. Still, this was a great purchase too, costing me under $100 used quite a while back, and I remember looking for something like this if you're interested in SACD or Blu-ray audio especially, since that's not commonly found on anything but high-end components anymore. Radio tuning on the STR-DH190 seems pretty solid, though I don't listen to FM radio much at all, so I don't have much to compare it with. It pulls in the stations I would listen to just fine though. By the way, I do want to upgrade my turntable cartridge. I talked about that in my turntable comparison video, but I just haven't gotten to it yet. That limited budget and everything, I need to pick my battles and upgrade a little at a time. So, between the Walkman and the receiver, I'm about $317 all in for both portable and home high-resolution playback. I'm pretty happy with that, for now. I mean, things change, and someday I might be more open to paying an extra $1,000 for an aluminum front face. I'm not saying this is the greatest setup of all time, just that it's a lot of value for the money, and it sounds great for how much I paid. I also feel like Bluetooth is now at least listenable, and that's probably understating it. I'm probably hearing more of SACD's full range, which I almost certainly was not getting before, and I have a remote. So it's a win all around. Now to just upgrade that cartridge, then pick up some better speakers, and I'm obviously going to need some better cables, and then media server.